Good afternoon, everybody. Today's talk is on Polish-American architect by the name of Daniel Libeskind. He is very much more than just an architect. He is a designer. He is a set designer. He is a architectural historian and a theorist. But today, this talk is going to focus on the stories that he tells in architecture, and specifically those of his Holocaust museums and memoria. So Daniel Libeskind was born May 12, 1946 in Łódź, Poland. He was a child virtuoso, and he actually started his career as a musician. He was very fortunate that his parents were able to provide him with an accordion, because having a piano would draw too much attention. And in post-war Poland, with Holocaust survivor parents, he wanted to be able to literally closet himself and his noisemaking. He says that the accordion is what helped draw him to vertical spaces, because on a piano you have to play horizontally, but on an accordion you have to play vertically. So he says that that makes him vertically oriented in his sights. But because he was a child virtuoso, he won an Israeli culture scholarship, and he moved to Israel in 1957, where he met and played with Yitzhak Perlman as contemporaries. And then he moved to New York in 1959. His family was one of the last immigrant boats from Poland to New York, and he credits his life in the United States in the Bronx and how his family, who were both working in the Jewish textile industry that was very common in New York post-war. And he was lucky enough to move into the first union-sponsored housing projects in the Bronx. And so his Jewish experience not only informs him as a person, but also informs him as an architect and the stories that he wants to tell. And today I am going to do my best to help him tell the stories of all of us, because one of the things that he is trying to change is to not only tell the story of just the Holocaust, but where Jews were before in these communities, during the Holocaust, and then how they have thrived and helped to shape their cities afterwards. And so please know that all of the building images and any quotes that you see have come directly from him and his studio. And those can all be found later on at libeskind.com/work. So I want to start off with his words and what it means to him to be Jewish, and what is Jewish architecture, if there is such a thing. So this is an interview done in 2021 with the Museum of Jewish Heritage.
Where you grew up. I grew up in Poland under, a dark system of communism, of authoritarianism. I was old enough to understand the repression of freedom. And being Jewish, having parents who were survivors of the Holocaust, seeing that the city in which I was born, Łódź, which was the third largest city of Jewish population in the world, New York, Warsaw, and Łódź. Łódź had 250,000 people, Jews, in the city I lived. When today the city has maybe 10 people who are Jewish. So if you think of 250,000 Jews disappearing from a city, 1/3 of that city was Jews. You think really that identity that is part of you and that is so deep, because it's not something you discover in a library, it's not something you read about, it's just part of your everyday world. And of course, coming to America was such an amazing experience for me as well as an immigrant. So yes, the Jewish identity, yes, that's me, definitely.
Right. Let me follow that with another question that partly emerges from that, which is there such a thing as a Jewish architecture? Or is there a Jewish sensibility about architecture?
Well, I think definitely there is a Jewish sensibility. I know in Yiddish there is a word Yiddishkeit.
Yeah.
It's what is it? It's not about religion. It's not about some narrow system of who you are or some traditions. It's just meaning to be part of life. And I think this sense is a very deep sense of this particular kind of Jewishness, which I wouldn't really compare to religion of the Jews, the state of Israel, any of those things. It's just a sense of the legacy that history of Jews has had on one's own deep framework. And I think there is such a thing as Jewish sensibility. There's no doubt. You could be a Christian or a Muslim and have a Jewish sensibility.
Okay. And you feel that sensibility is defined as a connection to history, as a connection to a larger historical arc of time? How would you describe it?
That's a good question, Paul. I would say this, that that Jewish sensibility has to do with memory, has to do with the act of memory. Now, in a personal way, it's very strange, but it's true. My grandfather was an itinerant storyteller who went from shtetl to shtetl, a poor man who made his living by going from little village to little village in Poland and telling stories and being remunerated for telling these stories. And I always thought, that architecture is actually, despite the fact that its structure and gravity and all those things, is a storytelling profession. Because if a building is good, it tells you something, it tells you a story. And I always think, even the stupidest, most banal, glass building that has really zero character tells you a story. It's a very short story, which says, I have nothing to tell you, but it's a story. It's a story. It's it's Beckett, So I've always thought, yes, that's part of the Jewish sensibility. The story that embeds itself in memory and that can be passed on and that has a longevity that goes beyond the time in which it is told.
I love the idea.
And that is the crux of his motif in most of his buildings, but is felt the strongest in his Holocaust memorials, is the fact that Jewishness exists in a continuity of time that existed before events took place, during, and after. And Libeskind has a very distinct style that we will see. And a lot of people think that it is very rough, but in fact, what he is offering is the cover to a book. And I am here to help guide you through that cover so that when you go and visit, or when you're able to speak to other people who visit, you can help guide them emotionally through the space. Because as all of us in this room know, that the emotional stories are the ones that are the most rarely spoken about. And those are the stories that in all of his buildings he aims to bring out, sometimes literally. So Libeskind began his career as an academic and designer. He was not a builder. He was a college professor until 43, and he did not even create his first building until he was 52. And he is considered one of these, great people who started their life, in their adulthood. And his theory and his teaching and his desire to get expressions across can be seen in even his academic drawings. So these are called the Micromages series, which is actually based on French philosophy. But what it shows is that every event has multiple spark points. And these types of multiple spark points is what he brings into his architecture, as well as this idea of fracturing and limiting, but yet bringing back together to create something new. His first building was the Felix Nussbaum House in Germany in 1998. And this was his first commission. And Nussbaum in the 80s and 90s was not a celebrated artist. And the town's history museum wanted to give part of their building to telling his story. And Nussbaum was a soldier in World War I for Germany. He did see combat, and he was very proud of his Germanness. And after the war, he became an artist of some success in his 20s. But unfortunately, as Hitler came to power, his parents were able to flee to Italy, and he was able to flee to Belgium. And like many, he was hidden in the attics of various houses. And unfortunately, what gave him away was the smell of his oil paints. And shortly after this painting was made, he and his wife and everyone was sent to Auschwitz, and he passed away. And much like Libeskind, Nussbaum has this optimism about his works. You can even see here the self-portrait with his Jewish identity card, where he looks directly to the viewer and says, the first one was okay. You know, I made it through the first one. Maybe I can make it through the second one. So Liebeskind's building, you can see in the lower left that it connects the main historical building, but then the experience of Felix Nussbaum is one of being shuttered. And you can see that there are 3 distinct slashes through the site, and each of them celebrate a pivotal point of his life. And so the shortest, of course, in the front is when he was a successful artist and when he was still able to blend his identities of German nationalism and his Jewish identity. But then it's bisected by this claustrophobic space of when he was on the run and whether he would ever see his family again, and then his time, unfortunately, in Auschwitz. And you can see, as Libeskind talks about this emptiness that we as Jews feel for not only our own families, but any other family who we hear about, there's this shredding, this emptiness, this void that can never be replaced. And you can see, even within these lines, they are made up of lines from the Star of David. And that is a theme that you will see repeated, these slashes in the walls that if you look at a certain angle, they show Jewish symbolism. So in the first gallery, we experience Nussbaum's art as he would have, full of light and full of hope. But lurking in the back corner, you can see the sliver of light. And as you continue through the museum, the narrowness makes us physically feel Nussbaum's hiding. And the way that we see his art becomes fractured as he is forced to create the art through slits of windows. And it is his first work, but it's one of his most powerful works. And he takes these elements of storytelling and continues to transform them through his later works. So this is the Jewish Museum Berlin in Berlin, Germany. This piece, so according to Libeskind, he says, this space exhibits the social, political, and cultural history of the Jews in Germany from the 4th century to the present, explicitly presenting and integrating for the first time in post-war Germany the repercussions of the Holocaust. The new building is housed next to the site of the original Prussian Court of Justice building that was completed in 1735 and now serves as the entrance to this new building. Liebeskind's design, which was created a year before the Berlin Wall came down, was based on 3 insights. It's impossible to understand the history of Berlin without understanding the enormous contributions made by its Jewish citizens. The meaning of the Holocaust must be integrated into the consciousness and memory of the city of Berlin. And finally, for its future, the city of Berlin and the country of Germany must acknowledge the erasure of Jewish life and its history. One of the things that Libeskind does show expertly is to highlight the history, hence the old Justice building, but also give us a space to grow into the future, which is why you enter through history, through the Justice building, go down to the tunnel, and then come out to the museum. So I'm going to show you some exterior shots of the museum, and then I'm going to show you a quick video of the experience, because this is not a site that is easily translatable through still images. Again, just like the Nussbaum house, we see that there is this twisting, shifting, folding back on yourself in the Jewish museum, which is again supposed to purposefully confuse the visitor. So here's the outside of the Star of David, and the slashes are much more precise this time. However, as you can see someone looking out the window, these slashes may look purely ornamental, but one of the horrible things about the Germans is that they were incredible note takers. And each one of these windows shows the view of a Jewish person's house who was taken from their home and sent to the concentration camps. So these are not abstractly placed windows. These are windows for you to see the houses of the people who are erased. And that is something that, again, few people really appreciate, but that's part of the experience of this museum. Also, it is meant to disorient you and to keep you trapped. And again, this is a site that is emotionally charged. It is a story of confusion. And so this cement and these walls reverberate. You cannot speak quietly in here. And that's purposely done because he's also trying to evoke the paranoia of everything that you say your neighbors can hear, and everything that you say can be used against you. And it is such a powerful place to be. And each one of these sites that Libeskind creates has the same sense of purpose and the same sense of trying to spark within us something that we know is there, but needs to be shared with other people in order so that they understand what it is like.
Daniel Libeskind's Jewish Museum in Berlin is situated in the Kreuzberg district and is the resultant of an ever-changing Jewish and German history within the city. In 1987, the German government organized a competition to expand and renovate the original Baroque museum that had been seized by the Nazi regime in 1938. In 1988, Libeskind's direct architectural statement was chosen as the winning entry. The museum utilizes the original building as an entrance. The abrupt zinc-clad extension sits quietly disconnected and in contrast with its surroundings. As an architectural manifestation of Jewish presence in Germany, the museum delivers a blunt yet hidden symbolic meaning. The entrance to the new museum is from within the Baroque edifice. After this initial descent, the extension is organized into 3 symbolic paths. These lines intersect and delineate separate architectural experiences that follow the narrative of a hidden Jewish identity. The first axis leads to the Holocaust Tower, a 24-meter-tall concrete void. The space, unconditioned through the seasons, has a single light source from a small opening in its roof. The second axis connects the museum to the Garden of Exile. With its tilted foundation and grid of 49 pillars, the experience is meant to disorient and help the visitor understand the plight of being uprooted during the Second World War. From within the labyrinth, a feeling of solitude predominates. Views of the fractured facade are maintained, but visitors are confined to the gardens and must leave by the way in which they entered. The final axis connects the submerged paths to the exhibitions above. A continuum of Jewish history is presented within a series of disjointed spaces along the zigzagging structure. Details of Jewish life and prosperity are presented, as well as reactions against discrimination throughout history through numerous interactive exhibits and displays. The starkness and intensity of Libeskind's spaces promote an atmospheric experience and an emotional connection with the stories told throughout the museum. In this way, the visitor leaves with a fairly comprehensive understanding and impression of the tumultuous history of Jewish life within Germany and beyond.
Each of Libeskind's buildings continue to have the same thought and intensity put into them. This was only his second building, remember, and sadly it opened to the public on September 11th, 2001. And he said that he gave the opening speech and then was told about what happened to Manhattan. And remember, he grew up in the Bronx. And so he said the first thing he did was to tell his wife that they belong in Manhattan again, and he flew right over. And most people are aware of Libeskind through his One World Trade Tower master plan, but his building was never created as intended, which for those of us who see how his visual memory works, it's a shame, but politics prevailed in that aspect. So one of the things I wanted to point out in the Jewish Museum Berlin is they have this Garden of Exile, which is amazing because visitors are forced to go in the same way that they come out, which creates this, number one, this antagonistic relationship, but on the other hand, it also allows you to see the faces and the emotions of those. The reason why the reason why there are 49 pillars is because the central pillar is filled with dirt from Israel. The other 48 represent the year in which Israel was created. So even when you're in exile, and even when you're in this space, we can take peace knowing that there's at least some dirt from Israel there that's grounding us in the middle. So the Danish Jewish Museum in Copenhagen was built in 2003. Now, please say when I say built, these buildings take years to do. So 2003 was the initial. Just like the stories in Germany, the story of Danish Jews are ones that don't get to be heard very often. Housed in the former 17th century boathouse and library built by King Christian IV. On September 28th, 1943, Danish Jews were alerted to the plan of the Nazis to come and wipe them all out. And the town of Copenhagen banded together to save 7,200 Danish Jews and 669 non-Jewish family members and row them to Sweden. And so this museum celebrates their story. And as Libeskind says, the entire building is conceived as an adventure, both physical and spiritual, in tracing the lineaments that reveal the intersection of different histories and the dynamics of Jewish culture and its unfolding in contemporary life. So, like many of Libeskind's buildings, they are connected to a historical place, and he doesn't want to touch that. So he creates an off-center entrance. And you can see that this museum is filled with vignettes. And so there's a close-up of one. But the inside is amazing because he takes the 17th century architecture and creates this literal boat trip with the way that the boards flow and the way that he is just using all of these fragmented and kind of jostling lines. And as you walk through, which is, as I have been told, very difficult to do in a straight line, the whole place kind of, gives you sea legs, I guess, for lack of a better term. And you can go and see each one of these vignettes. And this is a very small museum, but still very, very powerful. And a story that I don't think gets told often enough of how the rest of the European Jews fared. And that's another thing that we can enjoy from him. Now, the Dresden Military History Museum. Like the Jewish Museum Berlin, this is a difficult structure to look at and embrace visually, but then once you kind of get oriented beyond the book's cover, then you can help navigate it. So this building was the Military History Museum, has been used for many, many decades as a museum, but unfortunately it housed museums by the Nazis, the Soviets, and the East German governments. And so when democratic Germany came, there was a call to not erase that history, but to add to it. And so what Libeskind did was to emotionally and physically distance oneself from the traumatic past. A 5-story, 14,500 ton wedge of glass, concrete, and steel cuts through the classical order. An 82-foot high viewing platform, the highest point is at 98 feet, provides breathtaking views of modern Dresden while pointing towards the triangulation of the area where the firebombing began in Dresden. So, just like in the Jewish Museum Berlin that showed the windows of the Jews who were forced to leave, in Dresden, this site points to the site of the Dresden bombings. And what's fascinating is that when you enter this space, it starts off as any other normal museum, if you can call it that. You start with the left wing, and there's very pretty paintings and everything. And then you enter Libeskind's portion, which is 1914 to 1945. The whole view changes. And then when you go through that, it tells you about the modern military excursions of the German army, and including their tours in Afghanistan and other contemporary. So one of the interesting things that Libeskind did is that even though it looks like a solid mass, he actually created this netting. It is metal netting, and it is purposefully meant to evoke the outfits, the uniforms worn by the Jews, with the banding and the light and dark spacing. So even that minutia to detail. And what's fascinating is that when you go through the museum, just like the Jewish Museum Berlin forced you into the Garden of Exile, this again takes you outside. It's unheated. It is, so when it rains, it rains. When it's sunny. And it forces you out to confront the view of Dresden in your mind, both as it was, but also with hope that you can continue to move it forward. And this is what I was telling you, in the original Baroque building places, it's beautiful. Just typical museum. But then when you come into Libeskind's, it shifts, and it gives you an opportunity to come face to face with images of war. And they suspend all the types of bombs that have been used against the Jewish people, even to today, because many of us haven't had the sad reality of meeting any of these face to face. And so he gives you a space to show you what it would look like. And again, it's extremely powerful and it's extremely difficult, but it's a story in his lens of optimism that if we see it and we encounter it, then we know what to look for and we can change the future. Which brings us to his National Holocaust Monument in Ottawa. And this is a monument to all survivors of the Holocaust who relocated in Canada. And what I love about this piece is that this view from above, the outline of the building is a Star of David, symbolizing, of course, the Jews who had to hurt during this time. But each one of these pockets is further segmented into individual triangles, which also are meant to tell the stories of the other people who were put into concentration camps, like communists or Jehovah's Witnesses or disabled or Romani. And so he continues to try to tell the stories that aren't mainstream, but are as equally important. And what I find is fascinating about this monument is that no one will ever see this as a unified history, because history is not monolithic. What you see is this. Because when you are in it, it is the stories of you, your past, that builds the greater symbolism. And that's why I think this is just absolutely magnificent. And like his other buildings, this emphasizes the resonance. You cannot be quiet in this space because it's open air, and nor should we. I am thrilled to tell you that he is coming to Pittsburgh. I am absolutely gutted to tell you why, but as we all know, in Squirrel Hill, on October 27th, 2018, there were 11 people killed at a temple in our state. Libeskind Studios is bringing his healing power to this building. And he says, central to the design concept is the path of light, a dramatic skylight that will run the entire length of the building. The glazed volume will welcome all visitors and usher in light to all the spaces and create a main axis that connects a series of programmatic spaces for the various needs of the institution. And like we've seen in the rest of his buildings, he plays with this idea of fissure and the seen and unseen. And luckily, this space will have not only worship sites, but also museum and education space. And it is the light that is connecting everyone back to this space. And I believe that this worship area is just beautiful, because he's not only bringing in the stories of the people and the stories of the area, but he is literally transcribing on the walls what it means to be Jewish. I cannot wait for this building, because unlike the Holocaust memorials, that is a traumatic event that's at arm's length. This is not. And so I am very curious to see how he uses his language and his optimism to bring together and to say that this is not an old problem and we need to celebrate it. And so I cannot wait for this building, and I will do everything in my power to get there to see it at some point. And just like the World Trade Center project, this is a community affair. And one of his truths is that because he went through authoritarian regimes, all of his buildings, to the extent possible, are democratic. And so I guarantee that he will be listening to the people and to everyone to make this not erase, because I think that's something that his former buildings lament, is that when in doubt, get rid of and erase anything bad. And we can't allow that to happen anymore. And so I wanted to end here on an uplifting note of sorts. The fact that, even though we still have trauma in our collective group as Jews, there are still people there who are willing to lift this up and to bring hope for the next generation and to continue to tell the stories of what happened, because if we don't tell them, then that's when they get erased and that's when they go. One of the interesting things about this building as well is fatigue. is meant to set in. And unlike a lot of museum spaces that, want to allow visitors to be comfortable and to relax and kind of, soak in the artwork, this is a place that resonates with every footstep. It is just deafening. And it is not a place where you want to linger, but it's a place where your heart forces you to linger. And there was a spot where they showed the screaming faces. If you want to, you can walk through that and to actually feel the weight of everything. They don't force you to, because I don't know how I'd be able to. But it is, all of his buildings are an event, and they're meant to be. And he is part of a group who champions to bring emotion back into spaces. And so that is why his architecture looks the way it does. But deconstructionism is very jarring to people, and they think that it's hostile and it's ugly. But the stories within them are rarely ever that. I mean, look at the Walt Disney Theater. That's the same style, and it's beautiful. Bilbao, the Guggenheims, they're beautiful buildings. Libeskind also talks about why he uses so many stars in his architecture, because like that story, Number the Stars. To him, the six-pointed star is both the specific Jewish star, but it's also just one of the stars and one of the stories, and it's a guiding path. And so that's why he really digs into that imagery. But that boat museum, I sadly knew very little about the actual people involved, and just the amount of chutzpah that it took for a German Nazi to tip off the town. He was a German soldier, someone with military knowledge, and he told the town of Copenhagen, "Hey, I want to, this is coming," and they said, "Okay, but we can't move any Jews without official Nazi orders." And he went, "Right back. Yeah, they said it was fine." And they said, "Oh," and started it off. And I want to learn more about him. Libeskind does talk a great deal about that experience, including the lament that this event was very beneficial to Danish Jews, but unfortunately Jews from other countries were not afforded the same edict protection. And so like his family, who were Polish Jews, because they couldn't get Danish papers, were not able to be saved. So it's a much more complicated story than can be told in 15 minutes. And I want to go and visit because it just seems amazing. Well, I thank you all so very much. And if I'm able to do a part 2 on some of his other works, including his architecture that was inspired by the kibbutz, he's doing a lot of green architecture and integrated green spaces, as well as going back to his roots for low income and senior housing. And so if you are in Brooklyn, you can see maybe a few of his new towers being built for super low income senior housing. And again, there's just so many more things that we can talk about him, but today we have only this piece of the story. So, but thank you all. I appreciate all your time and you being here.